welcome back to Okay Sister Podcast. My name is Mads.
My name is Scout, and I love it when you just project. You know, we're just sitting here.
I'm always projecting.
Cozy. Well, you know, we're cozy in our boucle. You were quiet on the ride over, and all of a sudden, the lights, camera, action turn on, and the voice comes out.
Shit. Lights, camera, bitch, smile. Even when you wanna die. He said he loved.
No. What?
I'm wearing a house dress.
What was that? What song was that? Was that a Sabrina Carpenter song?
No, that was a Taylor Swift song, Scout. Keep up. I can't believe I didn't show you Espresso by Sabrina Carpenter yesterday.
Oh, yeah. We talked about
see.
that. Yeah, I need to know. Okay.
Sweet, I guess so. I'm working late.
That's good.
Okay.
That's good. You're working late. We are working late. That's for sure.
All right, welcome to the pod. This is going to be a meta pod, if you will.
I knew you were going to fucking say that because every time we talk about podcasting on the pod, you're like, this is so meta.
When was the last time I said that?
Like probably the last time we talked about podcasting.
Okay, so it's warranted.
But that was the
It's
thing.
meta.
That word was, I feel like, a trend for a second. People were always like, it's a
word.
meta.
It's a word.
It's a word.
So this is going to be a meta podcast because we are going to be talking all about how to start a podcast.
We're going to be giving you
the podcasting industry. We're going to give you the inside scoop. We're going to peel back the onion layers.
And most likely the harsh reality of what starting a podcast is, but also what the immense upside to starting a podcast and how it can transform your brand, your career, your sisterly bond,
Your sisterly bond. I mean,
your personal development growth.
There are some people that have been like, I would love to start a podcast with my sister, and other people that have said, I would murder my sister if I had a podcast with her. So I don't know if that's something we would ever recommend, is to have a podcast with your sister.
I recommend it highly.
I think it depends on the sister.
Seriously?
There are people that have told us that they would murder their sister if they had a podcast together.
Oh.
Listen, if you don't work, it's still a business at the end of the day. There's still operations involved. There's still tasks and things that you have to collaborate on. Mm-hmm. If you cannot do that with your sibling, like, do not start a podcast.
Yeah, I feel like we're really good at working together.
Yeah, but we've
also said that we could never do the real, like, we could not do
our like full-time job,
our full-time business where our income depends on it.
No.
You and I would have incredibly different opinions about things.
But this as like a side project,
it's perfect. It's perfect. Okay.
All right. You have the order of operations.
I do have the order of operations.
We're going to get into everything. Like, why should you start a podcast? What does it actually look like to do so? And then, like, really tangible steps. It's not going to be like fluffy, whatever. It's like really tangible steps of like how to get started. Like, what is your first step?
And we're also going to tell you, don't start a podcast if X, Y, and Z, right? So we're going to give you the realities.
Why not to start a podcast?
Why not to start a podcast? Okay, so first we're going to start with the history. For anyone who is coming to this podcast episode as a resource, has not listened to OK Sister in the past, we started this podcast at this point almost 6 years ago. So we've been podcasting for 6 consecutive years. We have never missed a Monday. Mm-hmm. And we've even gone through phases where we've posted 2 to 3 times a week. Mm-hmm. So to say that OK Sister is an ingrained commitment and part of our life is an understatement. Mm-hmm. Now that we've been in the industry for 6 years, we've been signed to a network. We've worked with incredible brand deals. We've done a live podcast. We've done merch. We've done, virtual events. We've really dabbled in it all around this podcast. And, 6 years ago, we always like to say we were 2 Jewish sisters who were floating in our career. We didn't have a network. We didn't have a personal brand. We didn't have a name. We didn't have a reputation in anything. We were dreamers. We wanted something. And when we started this podcast, the gates opened up for us, maybe not necessarily, within this being our full-time job, but it created a network for us. And therefore we went on to start corresponding businesses that the podcast has really supported over time. So as someone who has been in this, I work on Scout's agency within the podcast space where I book people as guests on podcasts. So I'm like really entrenched in the industry. But now that we've been here for 6 years, it kind of feels insane to say that we've been doing this for 6 years.
I know. Because it feels like it's shifted and changed so much.
Yeah, we started doing in person before the pandemic in 2018 and 2019. Then we shifted to virtual, and now we're back. We're on YouTube. We're doing video. This used to be a audio-only platform, so
no longer the case.
No longer the case. So it's gone through a lot of ups and downs, shifts, and we've been pivoting along the way. And I genuinely feel so grateful for this podcast and that we've stuck with it for 6 years because so much opportunity has opened up. And I think a lot of people are really surprised at how much we've actually worked on this for 6 years in addition to our businesses. So that's a little bit about what makes us credible to talk about this episode. We've also helped a lot of women start podcasts.
Yeah.
We've given a lot of advice on how other women can grow podcasts. I've helped businesses start podcasts. So if you like what you hear in this episode, if you want more, if you want Mads and my specific eyes on your podcast, or if you want to launch a podcast, we have 3 separate packages that we help consult with to help you start, grow, or we even do audits of your podcast to really up-level your content, get you those dream guests, etc. So just go to our Instagram at OKSisterPod. It's in the show notes. DM us the word podcast, and I'll email you a bunch of info if you want Mads and me to actually
work
get
more one-on-one.
Yeah,
with
work
you.
more one-on-one, which we love doing with our community who has podcasts because it's our favorite thing to talk about. So with that, let's talk about how the landscape has changed.
Yes. So as Scout mentioned, this used to be an audio format, which we were very excited by because that meant we didn't have to put on makeup or look at all presentable.
Yes.
And it just, I mean, I personally still exclusively consume podcasts in audio format. I don't really ever look at the video. That being said, the past couple years, and this is not really like going to be a surprise to people, video is a prerequisite to having a podcast. You need to be a video podcast at this time. Before it was not really video was not an element at all, and then with the boom of TikTok and Reels and allowing those mediums to help you get discovered, it's imperative that you have video content when starting a podcast.
And I want to pull on, sorry, excuse me. I want to pull on get even more specific in that. The reason why video is now so imperative to podcasting is that there is no search engine in the podcast app or on Spotify. There's no way to boost your podcast. You can't pay for ads. You can't do marketing within the podcast app or within the Spotify app. So you have to go off platform to market and promote your podcast. And now, so basically the way you market and promote your podcast is a direct reflection to what's popping off on social media, right? So Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok are so video heavy, which is why podcasts have had to become video heavy to market your episodes to then drive people back to the podcast app to either listen or watch on YouTube.
And then also there's just so much a shift towards watching full podcast episodes on YouTube.
Which I did for the first time on our podcast. I was like, oh shit, I get it. This is awesome.
Yeah, like I've watched The Toast on YouTube. I think a lot of people do. And this like listening behaviors or like viewing podcast behaviors have completely shifted. People are no longer just listening in their cars on the commute. They're actually watching YouTube while they're cleaning, while they're cooking, like whatever. And so that's why not only the clips are so imperative for marketing because it helps with discoverability and also the consistency of seeing someone's face over and over and over again. You start to be like, and just think about this in your own behaviors. If you're scrolling through TikTok and you see this podcast that keeps popping up and you see these people's faces, you're gonna be like, oh yeah, wait, like I should listen to their podcast. Like I did that with the Giggly Squad, right? I had heard them on another podcast. I think they were on Circle Time and Cody Ko's podcast. And I obviously love Hannah Berner. But then I kept seeing their clips on TikTok. I was like, oh, wait, this is really funny. I love their banter. Started listening to them. It's just, you're gonna have so much more exposure and surface area if you just keep inundating the viewers with either your face or by going on other people's podcasts. So there's repetition of like, oh, I've seen this person over and over and over. Let me check out their podcast because no one's going to discover you in the Apple Podcasts like app.
Yeah. Yes. That brings out like 2 highlighted points, 2 ways to grow your show. And we'll get into this more, but I just want to bring it out because you pointed it out. Be a guest on other podcasts.
Imperative,
which is how Mads and I built.
That's the word of this episode. Imperative.
Mads and I built OK Sister Pod by doing that. We would do swaps. We go on other people's podcasts like Minded. And then second is Reels, cutting TikTok's video content. Those are the 2 ways to really get in front of other audiences. So as a whole, though, the industry has gone through a couple more significant changes other than just from audio to video. You know, in the beginning, 6 to 8 years ago, I would say, people were hopping on. Very few influencer lifestyle-based podcasts they started to join. Mads famously said, 6 years ago that this was too saturated of a field. Why should we jump in? She was fucking wrong. So if you say that to yourself, just know that everyone says that at every point of the game.
And
so
also, it's not too
incorrect.
saturated. Don't.
It's not. It's
that's
not
a
saturated.
limiting belief. That's just gonna keep you from getting started. It's not saturated.
It's dumb. That our whole lives could have not fucking expand.
Would you not start an Instagram account because it's too saturated?
Yeah.
No. Would you not start a band because it's too saturated? No.
Exactly. So it started audio. Obviously, during the pandemic, everyone and their mother started a podcast. We saw this boom of lifestyle influencer-led podcasts. That has tapered off a little bit. A lot of people, I think, considerably in like the last year and a half, have stopped their podcasts.
That they started in the pandemic.
So we're seeing people fall off because the time commitment is really great. And at the same token, a lot of changes in the back end have happened because podcasting is wild, wild west, which we'll talk about how to get started. You host your podcast on a hosting site. You don't host it on Apple. You don't host it on Spotify. And this hosting site then distributes it to Apple and Spotify. So
and all the other podcasting platforms that you don't know of, but it just distributes it to everyone.
Everything like Google Cast, whatever. The thing with that is that there has never necessarily, the industry is always trying to find a standardized way of counting downloads. And so over the last 6 years, our downloads have gone through, every single podcast downloads have gone through shifts because I don't know what company does this, but they systemize the way downloads. And so different hosting sites, like Apple will count a download different than Spotify will count a download different than your hosting site. And so over the
subscribers versus downloads, like all the metrics are just
it's been
very
crazy,
strange.
Very strange. And so over the time, they're trying to get a uniform way of counting downloads, which can either bump your downloads up or put your downloads down, depending. And so I feel as if this year they've standardized it a little bit more, but that's just like an industry backend thing. Knowing that the industry has been trying to fucking figure out how to quantify listeners still.
Yeah, it truly is a headache and a confusion. And so when you first start, it's hard to know your progress or what is success because it shifts a lot and it's not very clear as to like, am I increasing? Am I decreasing? What is going on?
Yeah.
What is a listen? And like, what's also a meaningful listen?
Totally.
There was that one stat I think that we had looked in. I believe it's on Apple Podcasts where you can see where people have dropped off in the episode and see the average there. That's also I think that's a more meaningful metric to look at because then you can analyze, people are dropping off after my intros. Okay, like what's going on with my interviews? Like is the guest not good or the people are dropping off at this point? So there's different things you can analyze, but yeah, to Scout's point, it's been over the years just very strange to see the volatility when it comes
to your metrics.
To the metrics.
Yeah, and if anyone is listening to this who has a podcast right now, I just want to normalize what you probably went through in the last 6 months. So I started openly asking my podcast friends about this and they're like, oh my God, I thought my show just tanked.
Yeah.
No, Apple released a new update this year that changed the way subscriber downloads, counts, whatever, you can look it up. And if your some shows have seen a 30 to 50% reduction in download metrics, like reporting. So every single podcast has been hit by this update that Apple made. So I just want to say that because I thought every podcaster I talked to was like, oh, I thought that just like my show fucking sucked all of a sudden. In 2 weeks, I was like, no, they made an update and it directly affects your metrics. And Mads and I have been through enough of these updates at this point to know exactly what Mads says. You need to look at other metrics to understand the growth, the value proposition, and what your podcast brings to the table.
It's kind of like the stock market. It's
totally.
Like, don't freak out when it goes down. Just keep your money in the stocks.
Yeah,
and
keep
then
going.
Keep going. The longevity is more important.
Yeah. So with all of that, I wanted to talk about what a podcast can do for anyone who's listening, either as a content creator or even a business owner. Like what are the biggest ROIs, Mads, that you have seen and know to be true about podcasting, and why should someone start a podcast?
I believe that you need to get really clear on what you're trying to get out of the podcast. And we've said this many, many a time. You should not get into podcasting to make money. It will take you years and years and years to get you to a place where you can monetize. That should not be the number one priority.
Actually, you will be spending money.
You will be spending. It's an ancillary benefit.
Yes.
To make money.
It's your marketing budget.
Sure. And I mean, I don't have to tell people this, but it's a form of long form storytelling that just doesn't exist in any other medium. Like YouTube a little bit, it still feels more edited. It still feels more curated. With a podcast, it is fully raw. It's fully vulnerable. It is this deep, deep connection that you do not get to establish in a 15-second TikTok. And to me, when I listen to podcasts and I form that bond with the host or with the content, it is something so much deeper than following a content creator or seeing them, a lifestyle content creator, like on Instagram, right? There is this sense of, I understand this person, I understand their story, I trust them, and that then can span to any niche you have. If you're a lifestyle creator, then great. Like now I feel more bonded with you. I understand you as a person. I get your opinions, your stories, all these things. And then I'm probably more willing to buy something when you recommend it, right? With a business, like, yes, of course, there's a niche. Are you listening to me?
Yeah, because I'm just pulling up some stats around like this ROI. I just want to get this out real quick because it's going to really point this out. What you're saying. Anyways, keep going. I found it.
Okay. In terms of like a business, like, yes, if you are selling something, like this allows your customers to build that trust further with you. And it also opens you up to a whole other side of your personality, of, not just seeing static graphics on Instagram. There's a person, there's a voice behind the business or whatever you're trying to put out there. Also, if you're more of like an educational person, maybe you're teaching people about marketing, right? A podcast is an amazing way for people to learn from you, to establish yourself as a leader in the space, rather than, again, these like 15-second, maybe like shallow tips and tricks. It's so funny because over the years, all we hear is that our attention span is decreasing and that people are just on to the next. You need to capture them in 15 seconds. It's just not the case with podcasting.
Yeah, it's amazing.
For some reason, we are like completely throwing all that shit out the window when it comes to podcasting, which is incredible because you capture people's attention for hopefully an hour, like if they're listening to the whole thing. That's insane. That's so much value, and that's such an awesome opportunity to capture someone for an hour of their time.
Yes, 100%. And I would say if you're personally listening to this and maybe you're a content creator or you're a solopreneur, more of like an influencer lifestyle based business, when you start a podcast, that guest spot is fucking key. Like you can invite, once you get your podcast up and running, you brand it nicely, it looks nicely, etc. The people that you can talk to and have access to is mind blowing. Mind blowing.
Well, so that's again, we've mentioned this as well. Like the biggest ROI for OK Sister for us has been the network of guests that we have been able to secure and have conversations with.
Yes.
I think from a networking perspective,
it's invaluable.
It is the best and like the biggest hack, honestly, to networking is having a podcast, because you get to reach out. Look, of course, there's no guarantee they will say yes, but once you have credibility, you can reach out to people who you want to speak to and ask any question you want to someone for an hour of their time. Like that is unheard of.
That's also not that far off for so many people. People are like, oh, well, easy for them to say. They've had a podcast for 6 years.
Oh, no.
They secured can ask
guests.
Anyone.
We secured huge guests within like a month of launching our podcast.
And not just that. I mean, the landscape has changed a little bit. Now you might need to do 3 months before you. But I've worked with people who don't have followings, huge followings. We've launched their podcast and we have booked high profile guests onto their podcast very, very, very early on. It is so much closer within this medium than you think it is. These worlds are closer to you than you think they are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Something I wanted to say on the networking piece that just escaped my mind.
Well, say your ROI.
Yeah, but it was really important about networking. Okay, whatever. Also, if you are a coach,
oh, totally.
If you are a coach or a service-based industry, Instagram is so difficult to sell these days. The coaches that have had podcasts for a couple of years now sign clients like that because of their podcast space. Because before you sign a high ticket offer, if you have a business that has a high ticket offer, you need to establish trust. No one is going to throw 5, 10, 15, 20K at you if they don't know you first. So if you have a podcast, you're showing them your expertise, you're bringing on your past clients, you're utilizing your podcast not only for your network, but also to exhibit your work and your community. They are so much more willing to sign up with you because they know you. Coaches who have podcasts and be a guest on podcasts are making money from podcasting, not from the traditional ad revenue, et cetera. But yeah.
Yes.
So I wanted indirectly. So I wrote this down because I was doing a VIP day with a client to launch their podcast. And I really wanted to go through all of the ROI because I think the biggest myth Mads and I try to dispel is you start a podcast and you make ad money. Like,
no.
Ad money in the podcast world is fucking pennies and nickels, right? It truly is. The average.
It's based on, so just to clarify, the typical ad structure is CPM. So it's a cost per 1,000 listeners.
Yeah.
And what is that?
$25.
So kind of like work backwards. If your podcast is only getting 1,000 listeners or less, like that's less than $25 an ad, which is not sustainable if you're only doing one episode a week. Yeah. So, and that's pretty much the standard.
Yes. And then you have to have at least 5,000 downloads, I think, an episode or a month to even start working with an agency who is willing to book ads on your podcast. Exactly. I am a preacher of harnessing the purchasing power of your community to funnel it back into your business versus wasting ad space with your community to sell a vitamin, right?
Totally.
Like, first of all, Mads and I have ads because our podcast is at a certain place, and Mads and I don't have a business that OK Sister funnels into. But if you have a business that your podcast funnels into,
just sell that.
Sell your business.
Don't do ads.
Don't do ads.
It doesn't make sense. Also, really, the access to these types of ads, like the ones you hear people read on podcasts, that's because they're part of a network. And you can't really just like do those. You can't get those ad deals by yourself. Like you might be able to, but it's very difficult. The only podcast we know of that's been able to do it fully on their own internally is Almost 30. They like hired a partnerships person and they do all the ads in house. But it's very difficult because typically a brand will work with an agency that then talks to the podcast network
and buys in bulk for the entire network. Yeah.
Whereas you can't really just go to the brand and be like, you want to advertise on my podcast? They're going to be like, no, we have an agency that goes through that. Yeah. It's different than like getting a brand deal on Instagram. It's like completely separate. So that's where it's been a bit strange because it's different than most content brand deals.
And also, it's not worth your fucking time.
No, the outreach and this for the CPM, that's ridiculous.
It's not worth your time. So you need to find different ROIs in the beginning and different ways to monetize. So this is the 5 things that you will get if you start a podcast. First of all, you're going to get content, especially if you go on video. You are going to get massive amounts of content from one episode.
So that's also something we had mentioned is Gary Vee. He doesn't even care about the podcast itself. Yeah. He just cares about getting clips. Yeah. He's like, I do my podcast to get the clips for social. Like that is, and when we heard that mindset shift, because like, yeah, your reels, like our reels are fucking popping off like a million views. Like, yes, we would love that to translate to podcast downloads, but it's fine if that's not the correlation. Like your expectation, if it's like, oh, I'm going to do this so that my content on my Instagram is going to fucking pop off and I'm going to have all this quality content, that is a great metric. Yeah. So or ROI.
Mads and I, obviously, if you're listening to this fully, you're listening to the audio. But actually, Mads and I record this episode. And at this point, our main focus is being an Instagram podcast. Like our clips and our reels and our content is what we really push for. And we know that the diehard people are going to listen to the whole episode. We get to benefit from the whole episode. But our focus at this point, as we're shifting with the landscape, is getting the content for our Instagram. So one episode here will produce content that gets posted 14 times. So one episode will get you one audio episode, one YouTube episode, Sorry, it's actually more than 14. This is incorrect. This is how Mady and I do it. 1 audio episode, 1 YouTube. We do about 10 to 12 reels, which also gets posted on TikTok, which also gets posted on YouTube Shorts. So that's like 30 to 40 pieces of content that is posted a week per episode. And sisters, let me tell you something. I have been running the content rat race for years. Ever since I unlocked the power of a video podcast, I am on the internet more than I have ever been, and I do no content creation. Yeah. This hour gets me posted on the internet 30 to 40 times a week across YouTube, TikTok, and Reels.
We're not making those 30 to 40 pieces of content individually.
Talk about repurposing magic.
Yeah.
Okay. Networking. We talked about this, inviting high profile guests into your business's community. You can cultivate those relationships, and depending on your business, those relationships can lead to business development, collaborations, sales, clients, events, investments, endorsements from these high profile guests if you play that game right.
Yeah. So that's also another long game play is like, yeah, you might not get direct revenue from having a guest on, but down the line, they might be an investor in your business. They might, and you need to be always fostering those relationships and keeping up with them.
Yeah. For my book launch, I always say the story. When I launched my book, The Emotional Entrepreneur, I had 2,500 Instagram followers. And because of our OK Sister network and being a guest on podcasts, if you accumulated all the followers of the people who posted my book that week, it was like 7 or 8 million people. Yeah. It was crazy. Community building, as Mads talked about earlier, it's an in-depth space for your community to get to know the ethos, the mission, and the impact of your business. Pull back the curtain so they feel like they're a part of the transformation that your business offers. Lead generation. Mm-hmm. A podcast is a lead gen machine. You can recruit your community and podcast listeners to become users, clients, customers, followers, whatever your business model is. And then monetization. Is the last one I put because, in my opinion, it should be the last one that you really think about. Mm-hmm. Harnessing the purchasing power of your community by monetizing your audience, by advertising your next mastermind, book launch, user sign up, event tickets, promote and advertise offering and specials you have running, sell merch, etc. Those are really creative ways to monetize your podcast that feed back into your business versus, having an ad for someone else's business. That may or may not work for your business model. It works for OK Sister, but I'm super passionate about these 5 ROIs transforming your business or your social presence or your content.
Love it.
Yeah, isn't that great?
Clip that.
Ooh, I will. Okay. On to the next point. Why should someone not do a podcast? Don't do a podcast
if you are not going to commit to posting every single week.
Yes.
The thing about podcasting is the consistency is, I'm going to say it again, imperative. Mm-hmm. People need to trust that you are going to drop the podcast at the same time every week. If the schedule is off, if you're late, if it's a day late, it's going to confuse people. People are not going to either open up their app to remember that you've posted. They're not going to get that notification and remind them to see it in their feed. It needs to be consistent. So do not start a podcast if you cannot commit to doing it every week. It is not, you can't really take a break. Yes, of course, there's formats where people do seasons.
I'm adamant against seasons.
I'm adamant against seasons because do the thing when you slow down, you're never going to pick it back up again. Look, if it requires you to do seasons so that you get into the game and are consistent, then maybe it's for you. I have seen so many podcasts that do seasons and never come back.
Yeah. I say whatever's going to make you be consistent first, but second, whatever's going to get you to the point where you're doing it every single week. Mm-hmm. And the level of commitment that a podcast needs to reap the benefits that Mads and I have seen in our network, in our professional career, in our community, and everything that this podcast has given us, which is immense. That commitment, let's just show what that commitment looks like. That commitment looks like Mads and my schedule not matching up. So we're recording Sunday night at 8 p.m. after I put my daughter down, and then I edit it real fast and get it up on Monday. We've done it so many times. I have recorded this podcast before we did video in the car in a parking lot before I got my eyebrows done because that was literally the only 45 minutes Mads and I could get together. when it comes to this podcast, there is no excuses for us. Like, we're lenient on things, right? Like, we're not hard asses about certain deadlines, but come rain, come shine, come the fucking apocalypse, this motherfucking podcast is going up on Monday.
Yeah.
Maybe it goes up at 9 a.m. Every now and then. That's happened because we've had a technical issue or we've had a problem with the footage, whatever. But it has never not fucking gone live on Monday, period. Right. You know, 99.9% of the times it goes live at midnight the day before. So the consistency is such an important thing to talk about because I don't want to waste your time, whoever's listening to this.
Totally.
I'm all about like, oh, you know, if you have this idea, if you have this dream to start a podcast and it's been in your head and you've been churning it for days, like let's eliminate it from your head if this isn't the commitment for you, or let's fucking go if this is the commitment for you. Like,
don't let that scare you.
Let's get it out of the purgatory mode.
Be honest with if it's feasible. Like, does it matter enough to you? Is this what you want?
Yeah.
And this is the type of content creation. Like, I don't know, the clips, this could be your entire content strategy.
100%.
If
it's mine.
Yeah. Like literally it could be your entire content strategy. So then, yeah, a podcast does make sense because then you're getting all the content for the whole week. Yeah. Like if you're going to have to do content on top of that, maybe it is too much of a time commitment. Like it's just, you have to be realistic in your.
Yeah. And in the beginning, it's going to feel overwhelming. At this point, we have it on this like autopilot. It doesn't feel overwhelming for us because we know our process. But don't do a podcast if you're not willing to be completely consistent and if you're not willing to spend a little bit of money in the beginning. If you have no budget to start a podcast, do audio for now.
Yeah.
Just do it. Just get in the game, right? Like figure out audio later.
Ways I would do, starting on a budget. I would for sure buy, the only thing that you need to buy really is the recording equipment.
Yeah.
There are ways where you can get an external microphone and then record on your computer. So you don't, like we typically recommend getting the external recorder. It's called Zoom. Very confusing with Zoom video, whatever, but it's called
like
Zoom.
$200.
It's in our Amazon storefront.
That'll be linked in our show notes.
That we typically recommend as like an external recording device. But there are many, like I have a microphone that I used during the pandemic, which would just plug into my computer. And then if I was on Zoom or if I was whatever, it would capture that microphone quality. So there's definitely ways where you could just have the microphone, plug it in, but get like a nice microphone so it sounds good.
We recommend Sennheiser. The one that we recommend is on the app and on our storefront as well.
Yeah. I would still say to do video, and this is what I would recommend, is you record on Riverside. Listen, Riverside is a little janky, okay? But if you're not doing a virtual guest, if it's just you or it's just you and a partner, the Riverside on your phone quality is
really good.
Really good because it uses your iPhone quality, which is better than some of these DSLRs, right? So
set up a cute little corner.
Literally get a tripod. Put your phone either landscape or vertical. If it's just you, I would do vertical, so it just immediately becomes Reels or TikToks. Or if it's two people, do vertical. If you have two phones, you can hook them both up to Riverside. They can whatever. It connects the audio for you and it connects the video. So that is a low budget, lo-fi way to start capturing video because again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting a podcast without having some video component, and you'll learn as you go along what the quality looks like, all these things. But Riverside, I wouldn't just like record it on your video, like record it on your phone as like a video, an hour video. First of all, that's like insane.
You download the Riverside app and then you record it via that. Yeah, my team, someone on my team, Christina, she just started a podcast. It's called Empaths Anonymous. She does it with her friend. And they set up, go check her out, guys, on Instagram. If you guys are starting a podcast, Empaths Anonymous, because she started it with her friend a couple weeks ago, and they just created an at-home studio vibe, and they're doing that on their phone with Riverside.
Yeah, Riverside does capture really good video.
Yeah, they're a really good example of how to get something up and started without necessarily getting like a studio space that we do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
starting
on a budget.
Don't start a podcast if you want to make money.
Look, as Scout said, if you're selling something, that is where you should think about monetization.
Sorry, don't start a podcast if you think you're going to make money within the first couple months.
And if you think you're going to make money solely on the podcast,
yeah.
like no other like realm.
Yeah. There's very, 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 very few podcasts
that make money and make it's like a full-time job.
Where the host is that it's their full-time job. Like there's like
Scooper.
maybe 10.
Yeah.
It's not that many.
It's not that many.
But you have to ask yourself, sorry if we're scaring you. You have to ask yourself, there's a reason why we're all doing this. Like I will live and die by this medium because it has given me literally everything.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah.
Like the best connections, the best conversations, the best networking abilities, the best connection with our community, the personal development that's happened for me on this podcast, the connection with you, the reputation we have in the space, the way we've solidified ourselves within an industry. Like this medium over Instagram, over anything like that has given me personally, like, it's given me a standing in my career, I feel like.
Totally.
And not just because we're like, not just in the podcast industry, but in the lifestyle space, in the entrepreneurship space.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Growth tips.
So we talked a bit about this. The 2 ways that you're going to grow your podcast is through clips on Reels and TikTok. It's literally, and Shorts, it's literally the only discoverability avenue these days. As Scout mentioned, SEO within the Apple Podcast app or within Spotify, very limited. So you can do stuff with your titles, but again, those titles are more about capturing the people that already subscribe to your podcast rather than
New
people searching. Unless it's something super educational. Like for instance, people might actually type into Apple Podcasts how to start a podcast and see this episode.
Yeah.
That is an example, but you're not going to make every episode like that. So there's not really like a search engine. So clipping things for Reels and for TikTok and for Shorts is imperative. The next is being a guest on podcasts. That has been by far the way not only that we've established credibility and been able to secure bigger guests to come on ours because we're like, oh, we've been a guest on these, or like we've done a pod swap with these people. Find like-minded podcasts that talk about similar things to you, maybe in a different way. If you're a lifestyle creator, finding other lifestyle, maybe your friends, right? And do swaps with them. This allows you, obviously, to be exposed to their audience that they've already built. And then vice versa, you're giving them an opportunity to come on your podcast. Maybe then you provide them with content and clips from that podcast. This is going to be the thing moving forward. And this is why it's such a good time to get into podcasting is you have a lot of value to provide if you're doing video. You know, like we've had podcast guests come on now and say, hey, give me the footage because I'm going to use that as my content. Like these guests are getting free content from us.
That we're paying for.
Which like, if we didn't have that, it might have been harder to secure some of the guests that we've been getting recently. So that's a huge plus that
I wouldn't say that. I'm going to give us a little more credit.
No, of course.
We can pretty much get most guests that we want.
I know. But what I'm saying is what I'm seeing is it's
a big plus.
It's a big
plus to get people to drive out to where our studio is in Los Angeles during rush hour.
So I would say a long time ago when we first started, everyone wanted to be on a podcast because it was so new. And people were like, oh, I want to be on a podcast. So they would just come on our podcast because it was a podcast. That is not the case anymore. Everyone has a podcast. So people are a little more like, I'm not. They're getting a little picky with their time and not coming on as many podcasts. The video aspect, though, I think is going to change everything because founders are going to want those clips of them speaking so that they can post on their own channels, on LinkedIn. Like these are clips that establish them as thought leaders in the space. So like if they're getting free video footage, like quality video footage, it's a no-brainer. At least they should have enough foresight for that. It's a no-brainer. So those are, I guess, the 2 things to grow is the clips and the pod swaps or being a guest on other podcasts.
And just to give a little insider, what Mads just said about being a guest on a podcast, guess where I'm thinking? Awesome. I'm going to clip that shit. I'm going to clip whatever she just said And I'm going to put it on Scouts Agency's Instagram.
Yeah.
Because she just endorsed what we do at Scouts Agency, and it's on a podcast, and I have great video content now to post on my agency as well.
And I look great in my house
she
dress.
looks great, and she looks amazing. I was a speaker at Kathy Heller's podcast conference the other week, and we were talking about the guest spot, and we were talking about how to grow a show. And those things are strategies and tactical things to actually grow your reach and to market your show and to get in front of new audiences. I love being a guest on a podcast, because if you want new podcast listeners, you have to go to a podcast, because that's where they are. Where are podcast listeners? Listening to podcasts. So you go on the podcast. Mm-hmm. But I also got into a point in the panel where I wanted to actually reframe what podcast growth is, because as we mentioned earlier, Apple can wave a wand, or the IAB, I don't know what it's called, that whatever, they can wave a wand and change the way downloads are counted and change the CPM and change advertisement things. And so growing a show is not necessarily just about increasing downloads or increasing Instagram followers. I gave so many examples of growing a show means someone DMs you and thanks you for your content and says something resonated and made them feel like they could do something that you vulnerably shared about on your podcast. Growing your show is having a guest on that's a role model of yours, and then you guys are in each other's network and they support something you're doing. That's growing your show. Growing your show means selling a book that you wrote, or getting a client, or, some sort of monetary ROI that's not from advertisement, right? Growing your show means being connected to other people or getting in the door because you have a podcast. So you have to look at your podcast as this lead gen for all of the other things that you're doing, from content to network to sales to reputation to business development. So sure, growing your show means getting more downloads, but at the end of the day, a podcast that has deep, deep ROI is not just growing downloads. It's growing all of the facets that we just talked about. And the most beautiful thing that I love about podcasting is that podcast downloads are private.
Yeah.
Nowhere else in any other content medium are, we see YouTube subscribers, we see follower counts, we see views. Podcast downloads are private, and I love it because it's actually about a value proposition of who you are as a brand and what your reputation is, and the types of conversations you're having and the types of guests you bring and what your community is like, versus just a number. So sure, there's tactical things that can grow your show, as Mads just said. Be a guest, post video content, right? Repurpose this content on video, and think bigger as things that are growing your show.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Yeah. Oh, that was good. That came to me.
Clip that.
Okay, starting tips.
Okay, so these are going to be like really tangible tips.
Yes.
Right? First thing you need to do is figure out the equipment. Okay, actually, let's figure out, are you going to have a host? Are you going to have a host? Are you going to do this by yourself?
Ooh, pros and cons. Host versus co-host. Go.
Pros, you have someone to banter with, you have someone to lean on. It's a partnership. It allows the conversation to feel like you vibe off that person's energy. It establishes the show.
You're lifting only half the load.
Totally.
Especially in interviews, like if I'm blank or I'm like, this is a dud, Mads can pop in or whatever.
Or just like, then you could do solos, but it's not fully solo. It's, because doing a solo episode, truly solo, is very, very hard. Whereas,
maternity leave, Mads took over. Like, you can keep it going.
Yeah. Doing it with a host, especially as a beginner, is something I would recommend. Yeah. And it's more fun to do with
You just have to ask yourself if it leads back to your ROI goals.
Right. So then once you've established that, obviously establish what you're going to talk about, what is the...
Oh, but wait, a case for just a regular host.
Sure.
If you are a thought leader, a personal brand,
right,
and you are your own content machine, a co-host, maybe people do co-hosts where the co-host isn't like equal standing. I don't know how to say it, but also... I feel like a lot of people can have a producer that kind of talks in with you. Or like a friend.
You have that banter, but you're the sole focus.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, it depends on your business, what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Obviously create the type of topics you're going to discuss. This is something obviously only you can determine. The format of the show, are you going to have guests? Is it only going to be value add things? What length do you want each of the episodes? Especially with a guest, I would do intro or the little jingle with your intro, and then the host chat, and then the interview of the guest, similar to or the way that we do it. You can listen back and see the format. And if you're not going to have guests, then maybe I would recommend 30-minute episodes, 30 to 45-minute episodes where it's more just like value-packed, very specific topic. Understand the cadence, or when are you going to be posting, which day? Is it once a week? Is it twice a week? We've been seeing a lot of trends recently of 3 times a week, like 3 more bite-sized episodes a week. Do whatever is going to make sure you're consistent. And then the biggest thing is signing up for the RSS feed.
So I'll go through a checklist really fast. How to start a podcast. You need cover art, podcast bio, trailer, jingle, music, an RSS feed, a hosting site.
What's the difference between a jingle and the music?
The jingle is like the music plus the words. Like
okay,
your like trailer. Not you. We have a trailer is like a 2 to 3 minute version. The jingle is a 30-second version that
comes
goes in
every
front.
single episode.
Yeah. You need a hosting site, Buzzsprout, Red Circle, Libsyn, look those up.
Red Circle is great. We love Red Circle because they have I don't know if other platforms do this now, but they were the first ones that also had ads within their platform.
Yeah.
They were the way we monetized initially, immediately without having to be on a podcast network. They have really, really good marketplace for ads if you want to monetize like immediately.
Yeah. And get the equipment. We have our Amazon shop that I'll link, and then record your stuff on Riverside. I would say that.
Riverside
and then,
for the video, yeah.
I recommend Descript for editing if you're going to be doing the editing yourself.
Yes, and that also helps with cutting the clips.
Yeah. So before we get into, we have a couple Q&As from the community who asked us about launching, growing, starting a podcast. So we will get into those. But if you loved the information here, you want Mads and I to do a podcast audit on your podcast where we listen to a bunch of episodes, we do a consulting meeting, and we show you where to up level. If you have been dying to start a podcast and you want to sit down with Mads and myself for a whole VIP day where you will walk in wanting to start a podcast and you will leave
with a podcast.
With a podcast, basically. You just got to fucking record, right? Like a year map, the content, the strategy, the name, all the stuff we go over. It's been a really beautifully supportive container that I love doing with people who want to start a podcast. Or if you want us to consult with you on how to grow your podcast and really create a brand and figure out how to monetize, we do that as well. So just DM us podcast at OKSisterPod on Instagram, and we'll get you some information because this is like our favorite thing to support podcasters. Okay. Let's get into a couple of questions that our community sent us around this topic. Okay, first.
What does the sisterhood want to know?
The sisterhood wants to know how to make your podcast stand out while there are so many podcasts.
I believe that
it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I was going to say, there are so many podcasts, of course.
Throw the question away.
I think, and this is something I struggled with when we first started the podcast, is you have to understand that your unique perspective and voice is something that no one else is going to be posting or creating content around. Yes, you could be talking about similar topics. If you're a pop culture podcast, you're going to be talking about the same fucking topics that every pop culture podcast is talking about because there's only those topics. But it's your perspective, it's your analysis, it's your discussion or viewpoints that people are going to come back to. Again, capture those, make sure they're super uniquely you. You have a unique opinion on these things. Capture that on clips, post it on social, garner the trust of people to be like, "Ooh, I love her take on this. Let me listen to the podcast."
Yeah.
So there are so many podcasts, of course, but come back to what makes you unique. What is it that no other podcast has that you have? For OK Sister, it's the sisterly bond between us. It's the banter. It's the fact that when a guest comes on our podcast, they feel like they're part of our family and they don't feel like this is like a PR stunt for them or that they can actually relax. It's not this really uppity press, right? With us, it feels like you're part of the sisterhood, you're part of our family. That's our unique proposition that we offer to our listeners. You sisters, like, hear that within us. You tell us all the time. It feels like I'm talking to my sister. It feels like I'm like listening in on me and my sister's like conversations. So find that for you, and that's what's going to make you stand out.
Yeah. And to follow up on that, that question and that like, oh, find your unique differentiator, what makes you unique. There's so much, it's like saying find out your purpose. Like there's so much pressure on that.
Yeah, don't put pressure on it. Just know that you are unique and then just keep like, just know your voice is unique and it's going to
also
happen.
Know that you're going to find that unique differentiator by doing the reps.
Totally.
So you're not going to start a podcast and know exactly what it is that's going to be special about you in this medium or that people are going to relate to or resonate to, right? You're not going to know that until you start putting out content and you get feedback. So people have loved Mads and my sisterly banter for years, but I never really super felt, I didn't think of that as a strategy point kind of until recently, to be honest, when our reels started popping off. Like we can post the biggest guests with millions of followers on our Instagram and they don't get that as many views. But then when we post something with Mads and myself, is it Mads and me? Post something of me? Yeah, I guess.
Okay,
I don't want to be grammatically incorrect. Apologies. Of our sisterly banter, the reels pop off. And
it's
so
relatable. People love to watch that type of stuff.
So when you start a podcast, especially when it's around who you are as a person, allow yourself 6 months to a year to try out the content, try out messaging points, figure out how vulnerable you want to get. Usually it's the thing that you don't want to share that really hits or the thing that's like under your nose that you don't realize. Like Mads and my sisterly banter is inherent. Like I didn't realize that was a cool thing that people love. I didn't know that. So just give yourself trial and error, like room to iterate, get the reps in, and you'll learn what makes you special.
That's a huge one. I mean, with any creative outlet, with any project, with anything that you're creating, do not get discouraged in the first month when either you don't see results, not even results, if you don't feel like it's right.
Yeah.
Because again, it takes time. If you listen, which do not go back and listen to our first episode. It's fucking terrible. Like but the thing is the repetition, like you start to find your groove and suddenly it'll click of like, oh, right, this is what I had in my, when you're about to start a podcast, you have a vision of what it's going to look and sound like. And it's not going to sound like that in the beginning. It's going to be shit. And so there's going to be a disconnect between what you envisioned and what's actually being produced. So, but you have to kind of like get through the shit to then match up that vision with what's the reality.
Yeah. I feel like 6 years in, I'm now realizing what makes our podcast stand out. Like I knew it, but now I'm getting a lot of feedback. I'm like, oh, wow, that's what makes our podcast stand out. And that's our special sauce, right? And also just don't put so much pressure on yourself to know the special sauce. Allow it to be revealed to you. Okay, another question. How to be consistent?
Ooh.
So
just pick a day.
Yeah.
Plan out and stick to a schedule that is gonna be good for you. Like if Mondays are not good because you'll have to like do a lot of prep work on Sunday nights, don't do that. Like pick a day that the day before I'm gonna slot out a couple hours either to record the podcast or to edit the podcast, whatever. You can break it up in chunks. Like the biggest time commitments every week is gonna be obviously the hour of recording, if you're going to be doing your editing, however long that takes you, and then also outreach for if you have guests and more admin things. So that's like comms with guests, scheduling, organizing, following up with guests when the episode is live, obviously posting all the clips and this. So maybe putting aside like 10 minutes a day to post the clips, right? But the hour chunk to edit the clips. So again, you're going to just have to find the tasks. Like those are really the only tasks and schedule them in.
Yeah. And I think you have to ask yourself, are you a batcher or are you an on the fly girl?
Right.
We're really good on the fly.
I'm on the fly. I'm also with Camber and like my person, like I've tried to batch. I can't do it.
The reason we batch now is because...
No, batching, of course. Are you talking about posting the reels in real time or are you talking about batching episode recordings?
Batching episode recordings.
Okay, sorry. Nix that. So
we've always been on the fly.
It depends also what the content is. Your content evergreen? Is it pop culture? Is it supposed to be about relevant information? Then you can only record once a week, right? And post it that next week. For us, our content is evergreen. So we're doing in-person studio. Scout does not live in Los Angeles. So she comes up once a month. We batch record about 6 episodes, and that's what we post for the month ahead. So it just depends. It depends if your content has to be posted that week.
Yeah.
For
also,
relevancy.
we used to record the week of and then put it next week. Now, because we do physical locations, we batch. But I would ask yourself, do you do better in batching and sprinting, or is it better to record once a week forever and do it that way? That's how I would ask yourself to get it started. And then, even when you don't want to do it, you do it.
You do it.
It's like the gym. There's been so many times where Mads and I are like, okay, God, I'm tired. I'm not, my brain fog, blah, 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 blah. And we're like, let's just do a quick one. And then we always end up talking for an hour and feeling so good after.
Yeah.
So it's really
That's also something that until you do podcasts and if you've been as a guest on a podcast, or if you've ever done a podcast, or if you have a podcast, you understand this feeling. There is something, honestly, it's the biggest high when you end a podcast. There have been so many times we've gone into them being like, ugh, I don't feel good, the brain fog, and we leave. I'm like, oh wow, that was better than drugs. That was that, and your whole mood shifts.
Okay, so
everything.
I've been leaving in that moment after. So when we stop recording, usually we're like, oh my God, that was so fucking good. And the guest is like, I love it. I've been leaving in those moments at the end, 5 seconds, just so you can hear what it's like, actually, sisters.
Oh,
and someone
I like that.
DM'd us, one of our really, really OG listeners. She DM'd us and she was like, I love that you are leaving that in because I feel like I'm in the room with you guys and you guys are so happy and fulfilled at the end.
Yeah. And it's the pressure of the mic is off at that time. So it's really raw and, stripped down.
Yeah. It's good.
I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. But how to be consistent, I would figure out if you're an on the fly girl or if batching is going to help you. And that's the first question that I would ask yourself when it comes to that. And then low budget ways to grow. We just started. We would say reels, TikToks, YouTube Shorts.
Riverside
video
to capture
content.
The content so that you don't have to buy external cameras and things like that.
Start pitching yourself to be a guest on podcasts, to do swaps. You can DM me at Scott Sobel. I'll give you direct resources to do that. Those two things are very doable to do yourself. You do not need to hire out for that. You just need to dedicate 4 hours a week, I would say, to getting all that content cut and posted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I would say. Okay, this was fucking lovely.
This was fucking lovely.
This was awesome. Thank you so much, sisters, for being here. That was such a jam. As you can see, Mads and I jam-pack a lot of value when we are trying to help others start a podcast. We're very passionate about this space. So that was fun to see how much we know.
I know. I'm at first I was like, do I know enough? And I'm like, oh,
we know. That's what I'm saying. We know everything. That's why we help podcasters.
Things.
So DM us at OKSisterPod, the word podcast, if you want more information. So we can help support you do what we do. And because we fucking love what we do. Every day I'm like, this is our job. This is one of our jobs. One of our jobs. Anyways, we love you. If this was valuable, text it to a friend who either wants to start a podcast, wants to grow a podcast, and follow us on Instagram. We love you. See you next Monday.